you ever been quiet for a long time? Not opening your mouth, not saying a word. I'm talking complete silence. God was for over 400 years. The muteness from the creator of the universe. The one who said that Earth is but a footstool to him, was about to break his silence.
Zechariah.
It was a cry from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? As the sins of all mankind were placed upon Jesus on the cross, the Father and Son who had been united since eternity. Sin separates us from God. As Jesus bore that sin, for the first time in his life, he found him separated from God. Once in harmony and unity, he now separate. The agony, the pain. My God, why have you forsaken me? Silence can be loud, and it can be painful. We pick up the story today, and we look at the lives of two people. The Lord had been silent in Israel for 400 years. Had been no prophets, no divine revelation, anything. There were some promises left at the end of Malachi. There's a sense of expectation, but for 400 years, God had been silent. And so when we pick up and look at what were some of those promises left in Malachi, we see in Malachi, chapter 4, it says, "See, I will send the prophet Elijah." Remember Elijah. "See, I'll send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day from the Lord." And after maybe one more verse, it goes silent. 400 years. During that time, there's an anticipation, a building. When is the Lord going to bring these promises? When is he going to do what he said he's going to do? There's a tension. We have to ask a question today. That's a tough one to ask. What happens when you're trying to hear from God and all you get is silence? You ever been there? You've asked God for something, you've cried out, you've wanted to hear from him, but all you get is silence. And like Jesus on the cross, that silence can be deafening. It is agony. Many of you may be walking through something like that right now. That's how we pick up the story when Luke begins to talk about the birth of Jesus. He starts with another couple first. God hasn't spoken in 400 years. It's been silent. There is a tension. There is an expectation. And so Luke chooses to start the story in Luke 1, verse 5. He says, "In the time of Herod, the king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron." Notice it's interesting here. Both were righteous in the sight of God. Both were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless. They were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Now, if you ask my staff what that means, both very old. They will tell you it is a guy in his late 40s who probably signs our paychecks. I suspect he was much, much older than that. In fact, the story goes out of its way to say they were well beyond childbearing years. This was an older couple. It's interesting, though, isn't it? As we catch this story in Luke chapter 1, Israel had not heard from God in 400 years, and Luke begins the story with a couple who had heard silence to their prayers as well. It had been silent for them, too. They'd been praying for a child. They had been praying for God to deliver, and they were now advanced in their years, and all they had gotten was silence. By no accident, Luke starts here, but it does force us to wrestle with an important question we're all going to have to wrestle with today. What happens when your cries are met with silence? What happens to that thing that you've been asking the Lord for, believing in, on your knees, crying out to Him? What happens when that is met with silence? This couple wanted a child and had prayed about it and had not heard from God. And notice, though, that Luke goes out of his way to say to this couple that they were righteous. They were in good standing before the Lord. They came from good stock. They came from the right families. They did the right things. These people were blameless. It reminds me of a story, though, of Jesus with His disciples in John chapter 9. Just a quick side note. It's interesting what it said. It says, as Jesus went along, He saw a blind man from birth, and His disciples asked Him a really interesting question. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? You see, struggling with having kids, or whatever it is you may be struggling through asking, is brutal in any time period, in any age. It hurts. It's painful on the marriage. It's painful on the relationship with God. It's hard. But it was even more brutal during this time in the first century. Because we see from this verse with Jesus that if you were someone who suffered from something, if your kid was born with a disability or had a problem, or if you couldn't have kids, whatever it may be, it was a sign from God in this culture at this time in this community that you had done something wrong and God was paying you back for it. He was punishing for that. That's why they asked Jesus that question. What did this man's parents do? What did he do so that would make him blind from birth? They believed into the culture that you had these things happen because you had sinned. Can you imagine then Elizabeth's burden? The author says that they were in good standing, but crying out, going, what did I do? Why is God doing this to me? Why has He caused this to happen? Maybe some of you are asking that question as well. I want to talk about that a little bit today. And so I want to start, though, with something that I think is somewhat common sense, but I think it's important for just establishing a foundation for our conversation today. And it's your first fill-in for the day, so if you have your teaching notes, I encourage you, fill these in today. Go back during the week and review them, pray about it. Spend some time with God asking questions about it, because I think this topic of praying for something and asking God for something but getting silence is something that many of us struggle with, have struggled with. Maybe you're in the middle of that battle right now. I get it. But our first fill-in, I think, is an important one for today, and it says this: sometimes good people have disappointments. I'm not trying to be crass here. I just want to establish right from the start that just because you're struggling with something doesn't mean God's paying you back, that He's getting revenge. I remember I sat in a class once. It was called Overcoming Life's Struggles. A pastor made me do it. I totally did not want to do it. Totally felt completely unable to do this class, but obediently did what the pastor asked. And for the first 4 to 5 weeks, I tell you, I'm absolutely certain I made things worse. It was terrible. And I could tell they were frustrated with me, and I was frustrated with them. We weren't covering any ground. And I remember I just finally set my Bible down in absolute despair and just said, can I ask you guys a question? How many of you believe you're here tonight in this class called Overcoming Life Struggles because God is paying you back for something you did? that he's angry. And after a couple seconds, one hand goes up, and then 2, 5, 10. Almost every hand in the class was up at that point. Every single one of them believed they were there because God was paying them back, retaliating for something they had done in the past. That's why Luke goes out of his way to tell you this couple, they were righteous in the sight of God, blameless, hadn't done anything in that. And we have to be careful about having that attitude too, about blaming God for things that probably aren't God's to be blamed for. We have to be cautious. We look at that person struggling with cancer and we could say, well, God gave them cancer. God didn't give them cancer. We live in a fallen world where cancer rates are rising. And because we live in that fallen world, sometimes you get cancer. But it doesn't mean God gave you cancer. What is it you're saying about God when you say that? You know what I mean? You may have cancer not because God gave you cancer. You may have cancer because you smoked 2 packs of cigarettes for 30 years. You know what I mean? And we've got to be careful about blaming God for things that aren't his to be blamed. That person didn't die in the automobile accident because God wanted them to die. They died because another person chose to drink too much, get behind the wheel of a car, and they crashed into them. They died because someone else made bad choices. We live in a fallen world where people make poor choices, where there's sin. And you know what? We've said this before, but it's why I want to remind us today. The biggest problem with sin isn't always what it does to us. Yes, it is a disease. It infects us. It changes us. Disease, it is something you don't want in your life. But the biggest problem with sin isn't always what it does to us. The biggest problem with sin is what it does to the people around you. See, we don't often stop to think, how is my behavior, my poor choices, and the things that I'm doing affecting the people around me? Sin doesn't just corrupt you, it corrupts the people around you as well. And the effects can be long-lasting. So there's a few things I want to keep in mind today, some fill-ins that I want to talk about to just set the stage real quick as we have this conversation. And part of this is just to make sure our posture towards God during these moments when all we hear is silence is correct. I get that it's painful, I get that it's brutal, but we also need, at times, you know how you sometimes have to stop and say, let's check our attitudes? There's times we have to stop and say, let's make sure let's do a heart check here, let's do a mind check here, let's check our attitudes before we go forward. And so the first one is this: salvation does not alleviate the consequences of sin. Yes, salvation is available to all. God's mercy and grace is bigger than anything we can ever imagine. But take that person, for instance, we talked about a minute ago, that made a decision to drink too much, get in a car, and then hit somebody else. While God will absolutely forgive that person if they cry out to him, while salvation is available to all, no matter who they are, where they've been, or what they've done, there will still be consequences for their actions. Salvation does not alleviate us from consequences, and sometimes we're quick to blame God for things that we created. You know what I mean? Let me put it a different way. I believe God's a gentleman and he will let you sleep in the bed you make. And sometimes we have this picture of God like he's some kind of holy pooper scooper picker upper, and he follows behind us and he picks our poop up and he cleans it up. But that's not always the case. In fact, we learn from our consequences oftentimes. The second thing, not every life challenge is a failure of God to bless us. We can be quick to say, oh, that thing that happened to them, God did that, or you know what, God's blessing, his hand of blessing is off us, and that's just not the case. Again, I get back to the point, we live in a fallen world where fallen things happen. The illustration I often pick is, it's like a carnival, and you get into the bumper car ride, and you know what, you can drive your bumper car around and do fine until somebody starts banging into you. And what happens when that person bangs into you? Then you bang into the car next to you, and then the person behind you bangs into you, and then you've got this domino effect where you're banging and banging banging and banging. And that's what happens in life as well, too. We don't always see it, but when we sin, and in that sin, it's like bumper cars. We affect the people around us, and that person that affects the person around them, and it just builds and builds and builds like a domino effect. And it doesn't mean God's hand of blessing is on it. It just means that a group of people have chosen to live outside of the boundaries in life. They've exceeded those boundaries. They've now gone into somebody else's boundaries, and their sin is corrupting their life. And in life, we're like a bunch of bumper cars sometimes just bumping into each other all over the place because our sin causes us to do things we should not and do not want to do. But we must be cautious about blaming God for the things we do and the things we cause in life. Number 3, God never guarantees a life without pain. In fact, in John 16, he seems to leave us a promise. On this earth, you will find trouble. He told his disciples that. How many of you have learned that in this life there is trouble? Anybody out there? I have. Life has its ups. It has its downs. And in this world, because we're all kind of bumping into each other, in this world, because it's fallen, it's full of thorns and thistles, Genesis says. This is not as it was created to be. Messed up stuff happens because that's the world we live in. Number 4 is an important one. Health and wealth do not measure success. We can be quick in this world to look at someone and go, well, they're healthy and they're wealthy. In fact, I will tell you there are streams of Christianity that teach this. We call it the prosperity gospel. There are streams that teach this. If you just do these certain things and pay this amount of money and kind of act this way, God will bless your life. But this can be really confusing, especially to a group of people that are in that, because suddenly when they're like, well, yeah, but I'm sick now, or you know what, my finances are struggling right now, therefore God's not blessing me. And it may not be that way, because how many of us out there, again, also have learned that life has its ups and it has its downs. Life is a roller coaster ride. Anybody figured that one out there? Yep. And we can be quick to blame God or look at someone and say, hey, then God must not be blessing them. But you have to remember this. Heaven's metrics are different than human metrics. How God measures success, how God defines blessing is completely different than how this world defines it. And just because somebody is healthy and just because they're wealthy doesn't mean that they have God's hand of blessing on them more than someone else who may be struggling in a season today. Because, by the way, I owned a company once. All of my clients were multimillionaires, very rich people. And guess what I learned when I owned that company? You can gold plate a turd. Sorry to be crass. You can gold plate it and it looks shiny. And it looks right, it looks nice. You break that thing open and it stinks. Money can help you hide. You can buy a really good mask. But it doesn't mean that you're more connected with God than someone else may be. It is not a measurement of success. Number 5, God is not a cosmic genie granting our every wish. He's not an ATM machine that we put our card in and get things out. And what I'm talking about is our posture towards God. How many times, so in our prayers, how many times do your prayers sound like a wish list to God? God, I need this. God, I need that. God, I want you to do this. God, I need help with this. God, I need this, and this. How often do our prayers start that way? When's the last time you actually, in your prayer in silence, said, Dear Lord, what can I do for you? How can I serve you? What would you like me to do today? Sometimes our posture is one of treating God as if he is some kind of vending machine. And we put in our money and he's to bring back out the blessings. And that's not the God of the Bible. And that's why I'm saying we need to be cautious about our posture. The Bible says we are to approach God with fear. The fear that invokes humility. that God is God and you are not. We must be careful about placing ourselves above God and condescending him as if he works for us. He's not a genie. Number 5, difficult seasons don't always have an explanation. I'm guessing some of you have experienced this too. One of the things I'll tell the staff, I've said it to my family, and you're not being crass, it's that sometimes in certain situations you've looked for answers, you've asked, you've studied, and you just can't find it. You know why? Because the answer is this: it is what it is. Sometimes in life, you don't get the answers. At least not on this side of eternity. And like those bumper cars, you just might be the 8th or 9th in the train of bumper cars, so you may not even know what initially even started that event. So you don't always know what caused it. It's just that stuff happens in life because sin happens in life, because we live in a messed up world. We live with brokenness, and broken people do broken things. We don't always get an explanation, and we have to be okay sometimes in life knowing that we may not know and trusting God in those moments. And the 7th is a promise that we always need to remind ourselves of. God will use these difficult times, however, to grow us. He will. God doesn't have to send something. He doesn't have to cause something or even allow it. But God can choose to use any situation he wants at any time he wants to grow you, mature you, and make you more into the image of Jesus Christ. The question is, will you allow him at that time? Will you humble yourself and will you submit? So let's talk about Zechariah real quick as we look at this story. As we continue it in verse 8, it says, when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. So a little bit of history lesson here, a little bit of what's going on, because we don't really do temple worship today. So put ourselves in a first century perspective on this. Zechariah was a priest, and there was over 18,000 priests in Israel at the time. So there was a lot of priests running around Israel at this time. There were 24 divisions of priests. He was part of one called Abijah. As a priest, you served twice a year in the temple for 1 week. So for 1 week period of time, twice a year, as a priest, you went to the temple and you served for the entire week, doing what needs to be done at the temple. What we need to know as far as our story today is in the temple, there were 2 primary sacrifices made every single day. There was one at 9 a.m. and there was one at 3 p.m. They would send one priest in to go to the altar of prayer where they would put incense down, as you saw in the video on that, and they would lift up the prayers of Israel. They were standing right before the Holy of Holies because you were only allowed one priest, the chief priest, in the Holy of Holies one time a year. But this altar for prayer was just outside the Holy of Holies where they, single priest, lifted up that prayer. The priest was chosen by who was serving during that week, and they were chosen by lot. Whether that's like rolling dice or the short straw, whatever it may be, history does not tell us, but they chose by lot, it said. And that person went. The other thing you need to know, and the last thing that's important to know, is a priest only did this one time in their life. There was only one time that they were chosen by lot to go before the altar of incense and prayer and perform this. When we pick up this story, it's Zechariah's turn, which is interesting, which means that God is divine in his timing because he knows exactly what's going on. He knew who was heading in there that day. It was God's allotted time. That's where we pick up the story with Zechariah. As we continue with it, in verse 11 it says, then the angel of the Lord appeared to him standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And when Zechariah saw him, he was startled. I would be too. He was startled and was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, do not be afraid, Zechariah. This one's important. I should have bolded this. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he was born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of who? Think there's an accident here? No. God sent Elijah. He's to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. In this set of verses, we get our biggest takeaway today. And the one thing, if you hear nothing else, that I want you to hold on to. God hears your prayers. That's what he told Zechariah. Silence doesn't mean God doesn't hear it. Silence doesn't mean God's not listening or that he's not there. God hears your prayers. In fact, we see a beautiful image in Revelation where we're in the temple of heaven and the angel brings before God the prayers of the saints. There are angels bringing your prayers to holy God. God hears your prayers. Problem is when we ask God something, we often get one of three answers. One we like, the other two we have to wrestle with a little bit. Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes when God does answer and we ask for something, he grants it. It's in keeping with his spirit, and he gives it to us, and we rejoice and we love those moments. The second answer God gives sometimes is just no. We don't always like that one. Not fun. And it's for many reasons. Either A, it's not aligned with God's spirit and his vision and his mission for what's to happen not only in your life, but in the life of humankind. The second reason sometimes is God's protecting us. We don't always know what we're asking for. We don't always understand what the consequences of asking for it could be. The average 4-year-old would love to play with hand grenades, razors, and dynamite. Will I allow them to? No. The answer is no. Will they be upset when I take it away from them? You bet. But how many of you know it's for their protection? Right? And sometimes we ask God for things and he says no because it's for our protection, and we don't like it like a child. But he knows the future. He knows what could happen. The third answer is the one that's even harder to struggle with sometimes, and that answer is later. Some other time. Not right now. Yes, I will give you this thing, or some version of it later. It's just not going to be at this moment. And that's the one that can be really frustrating, because at that point now we have to wait on God. And we send those memos out, Lord, you heard my prayer, you know the urgency, you got the memo, right? I need this thing right now. And God's like, but my timing's not your timing. My ways are not your ways. My thoughts are not your thoughts. It's going to be some other time. And the most important thing I can teach you at this point, and what you've got to grapple with, is this. God is more interested in your response at these moments. Or I'll say it differently. He's interested in your heart and your posture at these times. When God says no, or when he says later, where's your heart? What is your posture at this time? I want to look at Zechariah's posture real quick, and I want to look at Elizabeth's posture real quick. What did Zechariah say? Well, in verse 18, Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this? I am an old man, and my wife is well along in years." Now, a couple of things. One is a praise to Zechariah. He said, my wife is well along in years. He didn't say she's an old woman, because Zechariah has learned, as I have, you don't say that about your wife, right? Not if you know what's good for you. So she's advanced in years. But the angel's going to treat Zechariah differently In fact, Mary, who we're going to talk about next week, Mary, the mother of Jesus, she would ask a question too. When she's told that you would be the mother of Jesus, she very innocently asked the same angel, by the way, how is this to be, for I am a virgin? And the angel goes on to explain to her how this will be. But notice the angel takes a different posture with Zechariah. And this is the problem with reading in the text, is it doesn't always convey to us the emotion or what Zechariah really meant. It doesn't tell us where his heart is. But I think we will see from the angel's response that the angel knew what was going on. Because we see in verse 19, the angel said to him, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at the appointed time. Another angel looked at him and said, I tell you what, why don't you just shut up for a while God works? Why don't you just sit back, be quiet, and watch what God's going to do? Because he's going to do it whether you believe it or not. See, what we see with Zechariah is he was being snarky with this angel, which gets to, I think, a common sense rule of life. Don't be snarky with angels. It can be bad. You don't want to do it. But a bigger point I want to put to you is this, and this one's tougher. Sometimes underestimating God is just as dangerous as rebelling against him. Do you hear me on that? Be careful about underestimating God. This is something that we have to learn from the story, that we got to be careful about underestimating God. Because what we learn is Zechariah had a belief problem. Over time, in the silence, he had hardened his heart. He had allowed bitterness and cynicism to come in. And it changed him. And the angel knew it. He could tell it from his response. He could see his heart. Zechariah had a belief problem, and at the core of that belief problem is God was not big enough for his problem. And so let me ask you, do you believe this thing you're praying for, this thing you're asking for, this thing you're sitting at in silence, do you believe God is big enough for it? Or have you allowed yourself over time to become bitter and cynical, maybe even angry with God? And we contrast that with Elizabeth's response. And very short, in verse 25 just says, the Lord has done this for me, she said. In these days he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace amongst his people. And what we see with one is that she rejoices and she praises God for what he's about to do, believing that he is going to do what he says he's going to do, trusting him that he is going to answer this prayer, even in advanced years, even beyond childbearing years, that God is big enough to conquer her problem. She praised the Lord, but the other one chose doubt, and that doubt led to disbelief. And I want to put a caveat here to say, doubt can be helpful. There have been things in my life that I doubt, and it's in that doubt that you have to wrestle with things. You have to dig deeper in the Bible, pray more. You have to talk to other people. Doubt can cause you to dive further, to learn more, to grow in wisdom, and you come out the other side. I've learned something. I better understand why I understand something. I know why I know what I know. It can be healthy. It's just like fear. Fear can be healthy in your life as well, too. There is a healthy fear I have that causes me to look both ways before I go out into a road. But if I take fear too far, what's it called? It's a phobia. And now it's dangerous. Doubt's the same way. It's okay to have healthy doubt. If you're here and you're doubting through something, you have questions, you're looking for answers, welcome. You got a room full of people probably asking very similar questions to you. If you're wrestling something with doubt, we live in a culture that's like, well, I have doubts, therefore I have to cancel you. No, let me just say, instead of doing that, why don't you dig in further, get around a group of people, pray about it, and say, we're going to wrestle with these doubts. We're going to believe that maybe these doubts are a gift that are going to cause me to grow, to become more, to learn more, and I'm going to trust God in this process. But if you take doubt too far, it can become disbelief. And now you're on a dangerous road. It's a tension. Zechariah had allowed his doubt to become disbelief. Gets us to our so what moment. I realize I know some of your stories. Well, that's here at our other campus. In particular, some of you are struggling to get pregnant and you've wanted to have a child for some time. And it's hard. It's brutal. It was brutal in Elizabeth's time, it's brutal today. And the purpose of this story wasn't to try to rehash those feelings or in any way make you uncomfortable. The hope is for us to learn from this story that we need to check our hearts during these times because it's a difficult season. For some of you, maybe that isn't the issue. You say, well, I'm not dealing with that, but you know what? There is something I've been praying about for a long time. Something I've struggled with, something I've asked God about, and it just seems like it's being answered with silence. And I get that. I know what that feels like. In fact, I tell you, I'm marching through that right now. You get silence, and it hurts. It's agony. And the two things that we must learn from this, I don't have a lot of answers for you. I wish I could just put a big answer on it and you go, you know what? God's going to take care of that for you tomorrow. I don't have that for you. What I've got is two reminders from this story. Number one, He hears your prayers. He hears them. They have not fallen on deaf ears. Number two, God is bigger than your problem. And what I want you to wrestle with today is to ask you, what is your posture? This thing you've been wrestling with, you've been praying about, you've been holding on to. Are you in a healthy place? Or have you allowed some bitterness and cynicism and anger in? And it's changing you. And it's leading towards disbelief. And you're demoralized. Guard your heart. This might be a gut check time for you as a coach to go, hey, dig deep, look in. Where are you at? God is listening. And all I got for you at this time, and I knew this was going to be a hard week, because all I got for you at this time is to say, hold on. You've got to trust. You've got to endure. You've got to believe that God loves you and has good things in store for you, and that His timing is better than our timing. His timing in this story was way out of whack with their timing, but in the end, they got something better than they ever prayed for. They got a prophet who would pave the way for Jesus. The last thing is this. It's just irony, and I just want you to know that. The name Zechariah. Interesting what it means in Hebrew. They didn't say in the story. You have to look it up, but it's really interesting. It means the Lord is remembered. Isn't that ironic? The Lord has remembered. My dear friends, God hears your prayers, and He's remembered. Trust in His timing and His ways. And don't get bitter. Don't get cynical. And please, don't walk towards disbelief. Don't do it. Let's pray.